The night everything changed smelled like truffle oil and old money. That is the detail she would remember most, years later. Not the crystal chandelier casting fractured light across the mahogany dining table, not the weight of the baccarat wine glasses, or the sound of 17 different conversations happening in careful, curated voices. It was the smell, rich and slightly rotten, the way certain beautiful things tend to be when you press close enough to notice. Elena Marsh, that was the name she was using, stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the dining room of the home she had spent 3 years decorating, organizing, and quietly making beautiful. And she held a linen napkin in both hands as though she needed something to anchor her to the floor. The dinner party had reached that particular pitch of false warmth that happens when powerful men are competing for dominance while pretending to be friends. Her husband, Dominic Marsh, sat at the head of the table with his shoulders pulled back and his jaw set in the way she had learned to read as danger. He was performing. He was always performing. There were 8 guests seated around the long table. Richard Callaway, the CEO of Callaway Meridian, a logistics empire that had generated $4 billion in revenue the previous fiscal year. Richard's wife, Margaret, a woman who wore pearls like armor and smiled like she was counting the value of everything in the room. 2 senior vice presidents from the company with their respective spouses, and Dominic's personal attorney, a narrow man named Gerald Hess, who had the particular quality of being present in a room without ever truly being seen. Elena had cooked for 6 hours. She had sourced ingredients from 3 different specialty suppliers. She had ironed the tablecloth twice. She had arranged and rearranged the centerpiece, white peonies in a low crystal bowl, until the angle was exactly right. And then Marcus, the junior associate Dominic had insisted on including to demonstrate his magnanimity, had reached across the table for the salt shaker and knocked a baccarat crystal wine glass off the edge in one careless sweep of his elbow. It shattered on the marble floor in a sound that silenced every conversation in the room. Everyone looked at the glass. Then everyone looked at Marcus. Then, in the way that powerful people redirect discomfort, everyone looked at Elena. Dominic did not hesitate. He did not look embarrassed. He leaned back in his chair, made a gesture in the air with 2 fingers, the kind of gesture a man makes when summoning a taxi he is not particularly worried about, and said, without lowering his voice, "Elena, the glass. Be a dear and clean that up. That's what glorified servants are for, isn't it?" He followed the remark with a short laugh, the kind designed to make others laugh with him. To fold the cruelty into something shareable, something that could be passed around the table like an appetizer. Margaret Callaway did not laugh. She pressed her lips together and looked at Elena with an expression that was almost sympathy. Richard Callaway studied his wine. 2 of the other men at the table made low sounds that could have been amusement. One of their wives looked at the tablecloth. Elena stood in the doorway. The napkin was still in her hands. Her face was completely still. What would you do in that moment? What would you do if your husband, the man who had once held your face in both hands in a garden in Lisbon and told you that you were the only real thing he had ever found, called you a servant in front of his colleagues? If he reduced 3 years of your life to a joke at a dinner party, would you cry? Would you defend yourself? Would you kneel quietly and begin collecting the pieces of broken crystal? Because the alternative is a scene, and scenes are so terribly inconvenient for a man who is trying to impress his boss. Elena did none of those things. She set the linen napkin on the kitchen counter behind her. She straightened her spine, and she looked at Dominic Marsh with the kind of absolute, level calm that if he had known her, if he had known anything true about her, would have told him immediately that something irreversible had just begun. She walked to the broken glass and crouched to collect it, slowly, with dignity, each piece placed carefully into the napkin she had retrieved. And Dominic laughed again, softer this time, satisfied with himself, and turned back to Richard Callaway to continue his pitch about logistics corridors and projected growth in the Eastern European market. He had no idea, not the faintest, most distant suspicion, that in 47 minutes, The front doors of his carefully curated home would be broken open by men in black tactical gear carrying the insignia of a sovereign European crown. That 6 armored vehicles, matte black, heavy as judgment, were at that very moment rolling down the quiet residential street outside, their engines low and certain. That the man who had spent 10 years searching every corner of the continent for a missing girl would be standing in that dining room within the hour, and that everything Dominic Marsh believed about his wife, his life, and his position in the world would be dissolved so completely that the dissolution would still be happening weeks later in lawyers' offices and boardrooms, and the quiet, devastating conversations that follow a man's professional annihilation. He had no idea at all. And that, Elena thought, placing the last shard of crystal into the napkin with careful fingers, was the last advantage he would ever have over her. She stood, carried the broken glass to the kitchen, and began preparing the next course. Her name, the name she had been born with, was not Elena Marsh. It was Eleonora Sophia Isabel of the House of Waldenmeer, second daughter of King Augustine IV, sovereign ruler of the Kingdom of Waldenmeer, a small, fiercely proud nation tucked into the alpine borders of Central Europe, with a constitutional monarchy that had endured for 6 centuries and a royal treasury that international financial analysts, when they bothered to enumerate it, described in terms of tens of billions, though the private holdings and dynastic assets made that figure laughable in its understatement. She had been 19 years old when she left. The night she fled was in November, cold and absolute, the kind of cold that Central Europe reserves for its darkest months, and she had packed a single canvas bag with clothes that were chosen specifically because they were plain, unchosen by a stylist, purchased from an ordinary shop on an ordinary street, and therefore invisible. She had left the palace through a service exit, a door she had studied for 2 years, timing the guard rotations with the patience of someone who had grown up understanding that attention is a resource to be carefully managed. She had left a letter, long, specific, and honest, in the way that only young people who have never had to maintain a lie can be honest. She told her father that she loved him. She told him that she was not running from Waldenmeer, or from the family, or from any dereliction of duty. She was running from the weight of being known, from the specific and suffocating certainty that every person who looked at her, every man who smiled at her, every friendship offered to her, was looking at the crown first, and the girl beneath it second, if at all. She wanted, she wrote, to be chosen, not appointed, not assigned, not strategically allied with, chosen. She wanted to know what it felt like to be loved for nothing more than herself. She told him she would come back. She was not sure she believed it entirely when she wrote it, but she meant the love, and she meant the promise, and she sealed the envelope and left it on the writing desk in her sitting room and walked out into the November dark and became, for the first time in her life, invisible. For 2 years, she moved carefully across Europe, staying in places where her face was not known. Her appearance had changed. She had worn her hair in specific styles, mandated by palace protocols since childhood, and simply cutting it and dyeing it a deeper shade changed her face in ways that surprised even her. She worked when she needed to, using skills she had cultivated during her years of private education, languages, art history, archival research. She became competent at being ordinary, which turned out to require as much discipline as anything she had learned in Waldenmeer. She arrived in London when she was 21. She found a position at a small private archive attached to a university library, cataloging rare manuscripts and managing the acquisitions database. And she was good at it in the quiet, meticulous way that people who have spent their lives surrounded by beautiful and historically significant objects tend to be good at caring for them. She rented a flat in a neighborhood that was unfashionable enough to be affordable and interesting enough to be livable. She had her documents, the documents that made her Elena Reyes, born in Oporto, Portugal, parentage unremarkable, and she had her routine, and she had the specific piece of a life in which no one knew her name. She met Dominic at a gallery opening. A friend from the archive had dragged her, insisting that Elena never went anywhere and that this was going to change, and Elena had gone because saying no had required more explanation than she wanted to give. The gallery was showing a collection of mid-century Eastern European photography, which was how she justified being there to herself, and she was standing in front of a large gelatin silver print of a market square in Warsaw when a man appeared beside her and said, in a voice that was neither pushy nor retreating, that the photographer had an extraordinary sense of how light decays at the edge of a frame. She turned and looked at him. He was tall, without being imposing. He had a face that was pleasant rather than beautiful, with lines around his eyes that suggested he used them often for expression. He was wearing a jacket that was good, but not expensive, in the way that men wear expense as display. He looked, she thought, like someone who had chosen his clothes because he liked them, rather than because of what they communicated. He does, she said. Do you know his other work? He did. They talked for 40 minutes, standing in front of that photograph. He did not ask her what she did in the opening 3 minutes of the conversation, which she had come to use as a reliable filter. He asked her what she noticed when she looked at a photograph and whether she thought the difference between documentation and art was inherent in the image or imposed by the viewer. His name was Dominic Marsh. He was 31, she was 23. He worked in business development for a logistics company, which he described with the cheerful self-deprecation of a man who knows his work is not interesting to strangers. He had grown up in Sussex, the son of a secondary school teacher and an accountant. He had worked his way through university and started his career at the bottom of a company he had since moved up substantially within. He seemed, in other words, real, grounded, self-made without the toxicity that sometimes accompanies men who have built themselves from the ground up and developed contempt for those who haven't. She gave him her phone number. She told herself it was an experiment. It was not an experiment. He texted the following morning to say that he had looked up the photographer's other work, and she had been right. The Market series was the strongest. She read the text standing in the archive kitchen with a mug of tea in her hand and felt something she had not felt in a long time, the specific lightness of being surprised by someone. They dated for 8 months before she fully let herself believe it. She tested him in ways he was not aware of. She wore plain clothes and inexpensive shoes. She drove a used car. She paid for dinner when it was her turn, without any theater about it. She talked about her work at the archive with genuine enthusiasm rather than apology, and he asked questions that demonstrated he found it genuinely interesting, or at least found her genuinely interesting, which amounted to the same thing. She did not tell him the truth. She told herself the timing was never right, and then she told herself she needed to be certain, and then she told herself it didn't matter, because what they had was built on something real. Her, the actual her, the part of her that had chosen this life, and the other fact, the fact of who her father was and what her birth had entitled her to, was simply context, background, information that didn't change what she was. She believed this for approximately 2 years. He proposed in Lisbon, where they had traveled for a long weekend in spring, when the city was mild and the light came off the river at a particular angle that made everything look like it had been lit by a painter who was trying their best. He held her face in both his hands and said that she was the only real thing he had ever found, and she said yes, and she meant it without reservation. They moved into a house in a good neighborhood, larger than what their combined salaries strictly justified, but Dominic had been given a substantial promotion and was adamant that the address was an investment and a statement. Elena did not care much about the address, but she cared about having space and quiet, and the house had a garden that she loved without qualification. She started to notice things gradually, the way a truth that is uncomfortable reveals itself not all at once, but in accumulations, each small thing dismissible on its own. Each small thing adding its that is uncomfortable reveals itself not all at once, but in accumulations. Each small thing dismissible on its own. Each small thing adding its weight to the pile. The first time she noticed was at Christmas, 3 months after they moved in, when Dominic's mother, Carolyn, visited for a week. Carolyn Marsh was not a cruel woman. She was something more insidious. She was a woman who had spent her entire life measuring her worth against the worth of those around her, and had arrived at a place where kindness was something she allocated rather than offered freely. She had been warm to Elena during the early months of the relationship, the warmth of someone approving a choice. Once Elena became permanent, the calculus shifted. Carolyn touched Elena's kitchen as though cataloging its deficiencies. She made remarks about the dishware that were technically complimentary, but managed to imply that the dishware's adequacy was surprising given who had chosen it. She asked Elena, on the third morning of her visit, whether her family had been in trade, and when Elena said that her family was in Portugal, Carolyn nodded in a way that communicated that this explained several things she had not asked about directly. Elena said nothing. She cooked the Christmas dinner. It was excellent. Carolyn ate 2 helpings and mentioned to Dominic, in Elena's presence, that she was glad he had found someone domestically capable, the way one might praise a useful appliance. Dominic, standing in the kitchen doorway, laughed. It was a small laugh, barely present, but Elena caught it. The way you catch a single wrong note in a piece of music you know well, and she stored it somewhere. Then there was Dominic's colleague, a woman named Serena Whitfield, who had known him for years and had been, according to carefully triangulated office gossip, interested in him in a way that had never quite resolved. Serena came to dinner twice in the first year of their marriage, and both times she addressed Elena with the focused, evaluating politeness of someone who has decided to be civil about a situation they find objectionable. She wore clothes that cost the kind of money that is designed to be noticed. She laughed at Dominic's jokes with the specific laugh of someone reminding him that she had known him first. She asked Elena questions about the archive in the tone of a woman asking a child to explain a drawing. After the second dinner, when Serena had gone and the dishes were being loaded into the dishwasher, Elena mentioned to Dominic that the dynamic was uncomfortable. That Serena's manner toward her was dismissive, that it had been going on for some time. Dominic dried his hands on a kitchen towel and said, with the careful patience of someone managing a misunderstanding, that Serena was just competitive, and Elena shouldn't take it personally. That workplace relationships were complicated, that Elena didn't understand the specific pressures he was under at the company right now, and how important it was to keep those relationships smooth. "She's important to my career," he said. "I just need you to be a bit more, I don't know, resilient." Elena looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to the dishwasher and finished loading it. Resilient. She cataloged this word the way she cataloged everything, carefully, in the right drawer, for retrieval when needed. The year that followed his promotion to Senior Vice President of Business Development was the year she began to understand that the man she had married and the man she had thought she was marrying were related by proximity, but not by identity. The promotion changed him in increments, each one small enough that she kept convincing herself it was temporary, situational, the result of pressure that would eventually ease. He began to care intensely about what things signified: the car they drove, the restaurants they were seen at, the clothes she wore to events. He had always been somewhat aware of these things, but awareness had become surveillance. He began suggesting, gently, then less gently, that her wardrobe needed to be updated if she was going to be accompanying him to company events. He said this with the particular condescension of someone who believes he is being helpful rather than controlling. He said, accompanying him, as though this were her primary function. He brought his mother to more dinners. Carolyn had discovered a new hobby in direct proportion to her son's advancement. She had begun to feel entitled to opinions about Elena's choices. The decor was too minimal. The portions were generous, but unsophisticated. Why didn't Elena consider a more prominent social role? Why was she still working at that archive? It's just not the kind of thing the wife of a vice president does, is it? Carolyn said at one dinner, over lamb that Elena had sourced from a specialist butcher and prepared with a technique she had learned from a Michelin-starred chef she had once, in her other life, had dinner with. What kind of thing? Elena asked. Working in what is it exactly? Cataloging old papers? Conservation and archival management of rare documents, Elena said. Carolyn smiled the smile. Yes, that. Dominic was at the other end of the table, talking to Gerald Hess about commercial lease arrangement, and did not hear this exchange, or chose not to hear it, which amounted, Elena was beginning to understand, to the same thing. She started counting. The specific, quiet counting of a woman who is measuring the distance between who she is and who she is being asked to become. The count was not angry, not yet. It was clinical. She observed the microaggressions the way she observed damaged manuscripts at work, with precision, with documentation, with the long view of someone who understands that deterioration is rarely sudden. Carolyn's friend Pamela, introduced at a garden party as one of the nicest women in Dominic's world, asked Elena within 6 minutes of meeting her whether she was hoping to have children soon. And when Elena said she wasn't sure, Pamela said, "Oh, of course, at your age, the clock, you know." Despite Elena being 27 at the time, Dominic, standing 3 feet away, heard this and pivoted to compliment Pamela's garden. Serena, at the company Christmas function, said to Elena across a drinks table, "I keep forgetting you work. What is it you do again?" And then, on being told, said, "Oh, books. How sweet." She was wearing a dress that cost approximately what Elena earned in 4 months. Elena knew this because she recognized the designer from a world she had once inhabited without effort, a world where that dress was not remarkable. She drank her champagne and thought of her father's library in the palace at Valdenmere, floor-to-ceiling shelves, gilded spines, first editions in 5 languages, and allowed herself, just briefly, the private luxury of the knowledge that she was standing in a room full of people who would dissolve into incoherence if they knew a single true fact about her life. Then she put it away. She was not ready for that particular door to open. Not yet. Dominic's manner at home had developed a new quality, directive. He did not ask her to do things so much as indicate that they would be done. He left dry cleaning at the door with the expectation that it would be handled. He added items to her errands list. He began speaking about the household in the possessive singular, my house, my kitchen, my schedule, in a way that positioned Elena not as a partner, but as a resource. When she pointed this out, once, on a Wednesday evening in the kitchen, he looked at her with a patience that was indistinguishable from contempt and said that he was under an enormous amount of pressure and that it would be nice if he could come home without being analyzed. She stopped pointing it out. Pointing it out had a cost, and the cost was absorbed entirely by her. The dinner for Richard Calloway had been Dominic's idea, conceived and planned with the precision of a military operation. Richard Calloway was, in Dominic's assessment, the single most important relationship he needed to cultivate. Landing the CEO of Calloway Meridian as a mentor, or better, as a patron, someone who would advocate for Dominic during the board's upcoming discussion of a new chief operations officer position, would change the trajectory of his career in ways that all of the incremental climbing had not managed. Elena was assigned her role. She would cook. She would host. She would be charming and presentable and warm without being interesting enough to draw attention from Dominic. She would be, in other words, the perfect supporting element, functional, gracious, and background. She agreed. She planned the menu. She sourced the ingredients. She prepared everything with her usual thoroughness, which had always been, she reflected, while blanching haricots verts at 4:30 in the afternoon of the dinner, one of her most fundamentally royal qualities, the discipline to do things properly, regardless of whether anyone was watching or would notice or would think to thank you. The guests arrived at 7. Elena stood at the door and welcomed them. She took coats and poured drinks and said the right things in the right register. Richard Calloway, up close, was a man of about 60, with the kind of face that takes up more space than its physical dimensions justify. He had been important long enough that importance had settled into his features, like weather into stone. His wife Margaret wore pearls and black, and had the contained grace of a woman who has survived a great deal. Dominic was magnificent in the way that men in performance mode can be magnificent. He was funny, without trying too hard. He was knowledgeable. He steered conversations with the light hand of someone who has practiced steering. Elena watched him from across the room and thought about the man in the gallery who had noticed how light decays at the edge of a frame, and found that she could not quite make those two men occupy the same space in her memory. It was during the second course that Marcus knocked over the glass, and it was in the 15 seconds after Dominic made his remark, "Elena, the glass. That's what glorified servants are for, isn't it? That's something finished. Some final internal calculation completed itself. Some last weight was placed on a scale that had been tilting for a long time, and the scale went down, and it did not come back up." She crouched. She collected the glass. She stood. She carried it to the kitchen. And then, standing at the kitchen counter with the broken pieces wrapped in linen, she did something she had not done in 7 years. She took out her personal phone, the old one, the one with the number that only 2 people in the world had, and she sent a single message to a contact listed under a name that meant nothing to anyone who might have looked at her phone, but which she had kept there all this time, like a key she had never stopped carrying. The message was 4 words. She set the phone down on the counter. She took a breath. She walked back into the dining room and began serving the next course, her face serene, her hands steady, the crystal water pitcher catching the light of the chandelier above as though it were performing its own small, private miracle. Dominic did not look at her as she poured. He was talking about Eastern European logistics corridors, projecting confidence, constructing the image of a man who controls his world. He had 41 minutes left of being right about that. The kitchen clock read 8:47 when Elena heard the first sound that did not belong to the dinner party. It was subtle enough that she almost categorized it as something ordinary. A large vehicle on the street outside, a delivery to a neighboring house, the ambient percussion of a city at night. But she had grown up inside the specific acoustics of security details, and something in the frequency of it, the deliberate, coordinated quality of multiple engines decelerating in unison, registered in a part of her that 7 years of civilian life had quieted but not extinguished. She stood at the kitchen counter and finished plating the dessert course. Chocolate fondant with a salted caramel center, served on white porcelain, with a dusting of cocoa and a single curl of candied orange peel on each plate. She worked with precise movements, placing each element exactly where it belonged, and she did not rush, because there was no longer any reason to rush. The timeline had shifted from Dominic's to hers, and hers was patient. In the dining room, she could hear Dominic's voice moving through the register he used when he wanted to demonstrate ease, the lower, more deliberate tone that he had practiced, she suspected, in front of a mirror. Richard Calloway was saying something about consolidation in the freight sector, and Margaret was asking Gerald Hess about property in the Scottish Highlands, and one of the vice presidents was explaining something about his son's school that no one was entirely listening to. The engines outside had stopped. Elena picked up the first 2 dessert plates and walked through the door. She set them down in front of Margaret Calloway and the vice president's wife, with the unhurried care of someone who understood that objects of quality deserved to be handled as such. And she was reaching for the next plate when the sound of boots reached the front of the house. Not one pair, not the casual rhythm of a guest arriving late. Many pairs, moving with the synchronized, ground-eating purpose of men who train for precision. Dominic heard it. She saw the flicker in his expression, a compression around the eyes, the slight forward tilt of a man who is calculating whether to address something or pretend it isn't there. Richard Calloway turned his head toward the front of the house. 3 strikes, heavy and authoritative, The kind of knock that doesn't wait to be answered so much as announce that entry will occur. And then, before anyone at the table had fully processed that sound, there was the sharper sound of the lock mechanism giving way. Not violently, not with the crash of a forced entry, but with the clean, professional efficiency of men who have been given the access code by someone with the legal standing to provide it. The front door opened. Elena set down the last dessert plate, straightened, and folded her hands in front of her. The dining room doorway filled with black. They wore dark tactical gear without insignia visible at first glance. 6 men, moving in pairs with the fluid efficiency of water around obstacles, taking positions along the walls of the room with the absolute calm of people who do not anticipate resistance because they have never needed to. They were not armed in any way that was theatrical or threatening. They were armed in the way that serious men are armed, functionally, as a statement of fact rather than a statement of intent. Behind them, in the hallway, Elena could see more uniformed figures. And beyond those, through the still open front door, the dark shapes of vehicles on the street outside. She counted 3 from where she stood, though she knew from the message she had sent that there were 6 in total, parked with calculated spacing to seal the street at both ends without causing a scene visible from the neighboring houses, matte black, each one. The long, heavy silhouette of armored SUVs with the particular low-slung authority of vehicles that cost more than most people's homes and were built to survive things that most people never encounter. Dominic was on his feet. He had pushed back from the table with enough force that his chair scraped the floor, a loud, graceless sound in a room that had gone completely silent. His face had moved through surprise and arrived at something between indignation and fear, and he was cycling between the two too quickly to settle on either one. "What the hell?" he started. One of the men in black held up a single hand, not aggressively, simply with the authority of someone whose hand in the air is sufficient instruction. Dominic stopped. Richard Calloway had not moved. He sat at the table with his hands flat on the tablecloth and his expression entirely unreadable. The composed stillness of a man who has been in enough high-stakes rooms to know that the first thing you do in an unexpected situation is gather information before you react. Margaret Calloway's hand had gone to her pearls. She was looking at Elena. Gerald Hess had gone the color of old plaster. No one at the table was looking at the food anymore. The men along the walls did not move, did not speak, did not adjust their positions. They simply stood, and the standing itself was the message. This room belongs to us now, and it belongs to us without argument. Then from the hallway came a different quality of footstep. Not tactical, not rapid, measured. The walk of a man who has spent his entire life moving through rooms that rearrange themselves in anticipation of his arrival, who has never learned to hurry because hurrying has never been required of him, because rooms wait and rooms will always wait, because that is simply the nature of the world as he has always inhabited it. King Augustin IV of Valdenmere walked through the doorway of the dining room of his daughter's London house, and the room became a different room entirely. He was 63 years old. He had her height, her actual height, the height she carried as Elena, the height that Dominic's mother had once described as a bit much for a woman, and he had the particular quality of presence that cannot be manufactured or learned or performed, that is simply the accumulated gravity of a life lived in full consequence. He was dressed in a dark suit of extraordinary quality, the kind that doesn't announce itself because it has no need to. His hair was mostly silver now, more than she remembered, and there were new lines in his face, deeper than she expected, carved by something she recognized with a sharp, sudden pain as grief. He had been looking for her for 10 years. She had known this, in the abstract. She had not let herself know it fully. She looked at him now and let herself know it fully. He stopped in the center of the room, at the foot of the dining table, and he looked at her, not with anger, not with the performance of a king in a foreign territory making a political point. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he had stopped permitting himself to believe he would see again, and the look lasted only a moment, 2 seconds, perhaps 3, before he assembled his expression into the deliberate composure required by the situation. But she had seen it. That 2 seconds was for her, not for the room. The rest of what followed was for the room. Dominic had found his voice again. He was drawing himself up, recalibrating, reaching for the register of aggrieved authority that had served him reliably in professional confrontations. "I don't know who you are," he said, and his voice was almost steady, "but you are in my private home without invitation, and I am going to need you to explain yourself immediately, or I will be calling—" "You will not be calling anyone," said the man who had entered behind the king, and who now stood slightly to his left, with a leather portfolio under one arm and the flat, precise manner of someone whose entire professional existence consists of managing complex situations before they become worse. He was perhaps 45, with rectangular glasses and the controlled voice of a man who measures words by the milliliter. "Please be seated, Mr. Marsh." "I'm not going to be—" "Mr. Marsh." The word landed like a hand on a shoulder, not violent, simply immovable. "Please." Dominic sat. He sat the way a man sits when his legs have made the decision before his pride catches up, and he gripped the edge of the table with both hands and looked at the king standing at the foot of it with an expression that was trying to be outrage and was increasingly becoming something smaller. Richard Calloway, Elena noticed, had straightened slightly. His eyes moved from the king to Elena and back again, and she could see the calculation beginning, the data points assembling themselves into a picture he was not yet ready to name. His wife Margaret had not moved her hand from her pearls, but she was looking at Elena with an expression that was no longer almost sympathy. It was something much more attentive than that. The man with the portfolio, the king's private secretary, a man Elena remembered as Alistair Voss, who had been in the royal household for her entire life, opened the leather cover and removed a single document, heavy paper, cream-colored, with a seal at the top that was clearly visible from several feet away. He placed it on the table. "My name is Alistair Voss," he said to the room. "I serve as private secretary and chief of protocol to His Majesty Augustine IV, King of Valdenmere, and I am here this evening in an official capacity on behalf of the royal household." He paused, not for effect, but with the precision of a man ensuring that every word has landed before the next one is released. "The document before you is an authenticated declaration of identity and royal lineage, notarized by the High Court of Valdenmere and countersigned by the International Registry of Sovereign Succession. It has been reviewed and certified by legal counsel in the United Kingdom, Germany, and France." The dining room was so quiet that Elena could hear Margaret Calloway's pearl necklace move slightly as she breathed. Alistair Voss looked at the table. Then he looked at Elena. "The woman you know as Elena Marsh," he said, with the careful precision of someone who understands that the next sentence is the hinge point of the evening, "is Her Royal Highness Princess Eleonora Sophia Isabel of the House of Valdenmere, second daughter of His Majesty King Augustine IV, and a direct heir to the Valdenmere sovereign succession." He let the sentence complete itself in the air. Dominic made a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound of a man whose scaffolding has just been removed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but with the clean, engineered precision of a structure being deliberately disassembled. A single syllable that was pure, unprocessed disorientation. The sound of a man who has been confidently navigating a map that has just been revealed to be for the wrong country. One of the vice presidents said, in a voice barely above a murmur, "Good God." Richard Calloway did not say anything. He looked at Elena. His expression had resolved, finally, into something clear. It was respect. The simple, uncomplicated, immediate respect of a man who levels long enough to recognize power when it walks into a room, and who understands that what he is witnessing is power of a category that makes his own look like a practice exercise. Margaret Calloway turned to her husband and said very quietly, "Richard." just his name. He reached over and covered her hand with his. Gerald Hess appeared to be considering whether he was having a medical event. Elena's father crossed the room. He did not move quickly, but the distance closed, and then he was standing in front of her, and she was standing in the middle of the dining room of the house where she had been called a glorified servant 43 minutes ago, and he took her hands in both of his, and for a moment he simply looked at her the way he had looked at her from the doorway, without performance, without the management of a king in a strategic situation. Eleonora, he said, quietly, just for her. She felt the name move through her, like a key turning in a lock she had sealed so long ago that she had almost forgotten what was behind it. Not the name, the voice, the specific frequency of her father's voice, saying the name that was hers before she had learned to be anyone else. She had not cried in front of anyone in a very long time. She did not cry now, but she allowed herself, for 3 seconds, to be simply what she was, his daughter, found, finally, in a house in London at a dinner party that had not known what it contained. Then she straightened. She squeezed his hands once. She turned back to face the room. Dominic was staring at her with the expression of a man whose face has forgotten what arrangement it should be making. His mouth was slightly open. His hands were still on the table. The carefully constructed reality of his evening, of his career strategy, of his marriage, of his self-concept as a man in ascent, had been quietly dismantled in the time it took Alistair Voss to read one sentence. "Elena," he started. "My name," she said, and her voice was level as the surface of still water, "is Eleonora." The word settled. "Eleonora," he repeated, as though the syllables were foreign currency he was trying to evaluate. This is... He was grasping for a frame. She could see it happening in real time, the desperate reach for a narrative that made this manageable. "Look, whatever this is, we can talk about this privately. Whatever your family situation is, we're still..." "Mr. Marsh," Alistair Voss said. Dominic looked at him. "I would strongly recommend against completing that sentence." Voss's voice had the quality of weather that has decided what it intends to do. "And I would recommend, more broadly, that you retain legal counsel before engaging further in this conversation. The Crown has several matters to address with you, and it would be in your considerable interest to ensure you are properly represented." "Legal? What matters? What are you talking about? She's my wife." "She is the Princess of Valdenmere," Voss said. "She is also your wife. Those two facts will require extensive navigation in the coming days. I would not underestimate the complexity of that navigation." Richard Calloway rose from his chair. He did it quietly, with the deliberate, unhurried movement of a man making a decision he has already fully considered. He buttoned his jacket and turned to the king with a slight inclination of his head. Not a bow exactly, but the gesture of a man who understands hierarchy and chooses to acknowledge it without being required to. "Your Majesty," he said, "I apologize for the interruption this must represent. We will, of course, see ourselves out." The king regarded him with the measured courtesy of a monarch who has assessed the room and its inhabitants with complete accuracy. "Mr. Calloway," he said. His English was precise, lightly accented, the voice of a man educated in 3 languages. "You have nothing to apologize for. The interruption was ours, and it was necessary." A brief pause. "I am familiar with your company. Your work in Eastern European logistics infrastructure has been significant." Calloway, a man not easily flattered because he had been flattered too many times to find it interesting, met this with a slight smile. "Thank you, sir. My daughter has spoken well of the dinner she prepared this evening." The king glanced at the table, at the plates, at the untouched fondant cooling on white porcelain. "I hope the hospitality at least was adequate, despite the circumstances of the evening." "It was exceptional," Margaret Calloway said, and her voice was clear and direct, and she was looking at Elena as she said it. "The hospitality was entirely exceptional." Elena looked at Margaret Calloway, and something passed between them, wordless, woman to woman, across the specific distance of an evening that had held more truth than either of them had expected to navigate. And Elena nodded once. The Calloways gathered themselves. Their coats were retrieved by one of the royal guards with an efficiency that suggested They had been briefed on the likely sequence of events. The two vice presidents and their wives followed, moving in the careful, sideways manner of people who want very much to leave a room without calling attention to the speed at which they are leaving it. Gerald Hess left without making eye contact with anyone, which was consistent with everything Elena had ever known about him. Marcus, the junior associate who had broken the glass, had not spoken once since the doors opened. He left the room like someone trying to become two-dimensional. Dominic remained at the table. He was, Elena observed, trying to construct something, some version of events that he could inhabit. She could see the process happening, the initial disorientation giving way to the tactical reach for a position, the attempt to locate the version of this where he was not entirely without recourse. Eleonora, he said, and the use of the name was deliberate. She could hear him calculating that adopting it was an act of alignment, of catching up, of demonstrating that he was adaptable. Whatever's happened here tonight, we have a marriage. We have built something together. I know there are things that... He stopped, started again. I love you. That hasn't changed. Whatever title you have, whoever your father is, that doesn't change what we are. She looked at him. She looked at him with the complete, unhurried attention of someone who has arrived at the end of something and is observing it clearly for the first time. She saw the house he had chosen for its address. She heard his mother's voice. She heard Serena Whitfield's laugh. She heard glorified servants echoing off mahogany and baccarat crystal, heard it in front of the man he'd most wanted to impress, in the house she had cooked and cleaned and organized and made beautiful. She looked at her husband and felt, with great clarity, nothing at all. You called me a servant, she said, in your own home, in front of guests, because a glass broke. It was a bad joke. I was stressed about the dinner. You know how much was riding on tonight, and You called me a servant, she said again, not louder, simply with the same level weight, because that is what you think I am. Not a bad joke, not stress. What you said out loud is what you believe when you are not managing your image. She tilted her head slightly. I spent 3 years being very, very attentive to the difference between the person you were performing and the person you are. Tonight you stopped performing. Dominic's jaw tightened. The tactical attempt at reconciliation was losing ground to the other thing. The resentment, the wounded pride, the refusal to be wrong that had always been the structural fault beneath everything else. So that's it? You're just going to, what, leave because of one comment at a dinner party? After everything I've given you? Everything you've given me, Elena repeated. Yes. She looked around the room. At the tablecloth she had ironed twice. At the centerpiece of white peonies she had arranged and rearranged. At the kitchen door, beyond which 6 hours of her labor sat in clean containers and on spotless counters. I'll see to it that the relevant documents are filed through the appropriate channels. Alistair will ensure the process is orderly. Voss, standing by the wall, inclined his head without surprise. He had, clearly, anticipated this exact sequence. Dominic stood. He moved around the table, reaching for her arm, and 2 of the guards shifted without visible haste from their positions along the wall, in the path between Dominic and Elena, with a naturalness that made the move look almost incidental, as though they had simply decided, simultaneously, to stand in slightly different places. Dominic stopped. He looked at the guards. He looked at Elena. He looked at her father, who was watching the entire scene with the contained, assessing calm of a man who has managed diplomatic situations his entire life, and who is, beneath the containment, doing something far more dangerous. He was remembering every specific detail, filing it with precision, in the way that people with power file information, not as grievance, but as data, usable later, in ways that the person being assessed cannot yet imagine. You can't just, Dominic started. Dominic, Elena said, and his name in her mouth sounded, for the first time, simply like a sound. Stop. He stopped. She picked up her evening bag from the sideboard, the small dark blue bag she had placed there at the start of the evening, which had seemed, 2 hours ago, like an ordinary object in the background of an ordinary night. She looped it over her wrist. She straightened the cuff of her dress. A small, precise adjustment. She walked to her father's side. He offered his arm. She took it. And for the first time in 7 years, she walked through a room with the full, natural, unguarded posture of a princess. Not performed, not constructed, simply released, because it had always been there, all along, underneath the archive, and the linen napkin, and the dinner party, and the name, Elena Marsh. It had been there, the way the bones are inside the body, fundamental, structural, invisible, until illuminated. They walked through the dining room, through the hallway, past the coat still hanging on the rack. She had installed herself on a Saturday morning 2 winters ago, through the front door, which stood open into the night. She did not look back. The street outside held 6 matte black armored SUVs. They sat along the curb with the quiet, enormous authority of objects that do not need to announce themselves. Their engines were running, a sound that was barely sound, a vibration in the chest, rather than a noise in the ear. The nearest vehicle had its rear door open, held by a man in a dark uniform who stood with the precise stillness of someone who has been trained to be part of the architecture of a moment, rather than a participant in it. The night air was cold and clear. London at 9 o'clock in an expensive residential street, somewhere distant, traffic moved. In the adjacent gardens, something small and nocturnal moved through underbrush. The stars were the approximate version of themselves that cities permit, a handful scattered across a sky that was purple, where it met the glow of the city light. Elena stood on the pavement outside the house and took a breath of air that did not smell like truffle oil or baccarat crystal, or the particular airless warmth of a room full of people performing wealth. It smelled like cold stone and vehicle exhaust, and the faint, distant green of the park 2 streets over. Her father walked with her to the car. At the door, he stopped, and they looked at each other again. Not the look from the doorway, when she had needed the moment to herself. This one was different. This was both of them together in the fact of it. The decade between them, the letter she had left on the writing desk, the 100 different ways a family can be separated, and 100 different ways it can reconvene. I read everything, he said. Every year. All of your file updates. She looked at him. I know. You knew we were looking. I knew, she said. I'm sorry it took me this long to be ready. He was quiet for a moment. Were you? Ready? She thought about the glass breaking, about the sound of it, about the 47 minutes that had passed between that sound and this pavement. He made me ready, she said. So in a way, he did the one useful thing he was ever going to do for me. Her father almost smiled. It was the smile she remembered, the one that lived mostly in his eyes, that appeared so rarely that she had as a child constructed elaborate strategies to produce it. Come home, he said, or come to the Paris residence if you prefer, or the Zurich house. Come wherever you want, but come to a place that is yours. Yes, she said. All right. He walked her to the car door. She got in. The seat was warm, and the interior smelled of leather, and the faint, specific cologne that had meant safety for the first 19 years of her life. The door closed. Through the tinted window, she could see the front of the house. The dining room light was still on. The shape of Dominic standing in the window, just his silhouette, the outline of a man framed in his own illumination, growing smaller as the convoy moved away. She watched until the street curved and the house disappeared. Then she looked forward. The phone call came at 9:47 the following morning. Dominic was at his desk at Callaway Meridian's headquarters, having arrived early in a calculated attempt to control whatever narrative he could, when Richard Callaway's assistant called and asked if Dominic could come to the executive floor. Now please. Richard Callaway's office was on the 31st floor, with views of the city that cost exactly what they cost. Everything. The room itself was furnished with the restraint of serious money. Nothing decorative, nothing performative, simply quality at every surface. Because quality that needs no announcement is the only kind worth having. Dominic walked in with what he believed was the right posture for the situation. He had rehearsed several versions of the conversation on his commute. He had considered the angles. He had prepared. Richard Callaway was standing at the window. He did not turn around when Dominic came in. There was a woman at the conference table that ran along one side of the room. A woman Dominic did not recognize, in a charcoal suit of devastating quality, with a document portfolio open in front of her and a pen in her hand. She looked up when he entered with the calm, assessing look of someone who has been briefed on the subject and found the briefing sufficient. "Dominic," Richard Calloway said, still facing the window. "Richard, I want to say that last night was—" "I'm going to stop you there." Calloway turned. His face was the face of last night, composed, clear, carrying nothing unexamined. "Sit down." Dominic sat. "The woman at the table is Claire Ashworth. She is the company's chief legal officer." A pause. "This is an HR meeting. It has been recorded from the beginning of the conversation." Dominic looked at Claire Ashworth. She was already writing something. "What is this about?" "Last night," Calloway said, "you referred to your wife as a glorified servant in front of 8 guests, including 2 senior vice presidents of this company and myself." A pause. "Your wife," it subsequently emerged, "is a princess of a sovereign European nation. Her family's holding company controls commercial property interests in 7 countries, including 2 logistics hubs that my company uses. Her family's investment portfolio includes a 5.3% stake in a company we have been in acquisition discussions with since March." Dominic said nothing. "Beyond the financial dimensions," Calloway continued, and his voice did not change register, but something in it sharpened, became more specific. "There is the straightforward matter of what you said and how you said it. I was in that room. I heard it. The manner in which you spoke to your wife, the manner in which you have apparently been speaking to and about her, is inconsistent with the values this company holds as matters of non-negotiable conduct." Claire Ashworth slid a document across the table. Dominic looked at it without picking it up. "The language of the separation agreement is standard," she said. Her voice was the voice of a woman who has had this conversation many times and found efficiency more useful than warmth in the having of it. "You will note the effective date." "Today," Dominic said. "Effective this morning," she confirmed. "Your access to company systems was suspended at 8 a.m. Your personal items will be delivered to your home address by end of business. The company thanks you for your contributions and wishes you success in your future endeavors." The sentence landed with the specific finality of a door being closed from the outside. Dominic looked at Richard Calloway. He was looking for something, a softening, an opening, the suggestion that there was something to negotiate. He had built his entire professional identity on the belief that there was always something to negotiate, always a version of events that could be reframed, always a relationship to leverage. Richard Calloway looked back at him with the clear, complete absence of any of those things. "I would add," Calloway said, moving toward the door, "that I will be contacting the Valdenmere royal household next week, as a courtesy." He paused at the door. "You called a princess your servant, in my presence, at a dinner I attended as your guest." He let the sentence sit for a moment. "I trust you understand why that is a problem I am not able to absorb." He left. Claire Ashworth gave Dominic a pen. He signed. He had run the calculation during the 30 seconds between Richard Calloway leaving the room and the pen arriving in front of him, and the calculation had reached a conclusion that no countermove was available. The foundation had been removed. There was nothing to build a counter-argument on. He signed. He left the building through the lobby at 10:15, carrying the badge he had turned in at the security desk, which was a reflex error. He'd handed it over before the guard asked for it, the gesture of a man who had already vacated the role, and he walked out onto the street, into a Tuesday morning that looked entirely like every other Tuesday morning London had ever produced, unremarkable and gray and continuous, indifferent to the specific catastrophe of one man's trajectory. The story of what had happened reached the professional network he inhabited by the following afternoon, spread with the particular velocity of information that is too specific and too verifiable to be dismissed as rumor. Several people called him. 2 did not call him who he would have expected to call him, which told him something about the completeness of what had occurred. Serena Whitfield sent a message that read simply, "I heard. I'm sorry." He did not respond. His mother called from Sussex, and he let it go to voicemail and then listened to it twice without responding. Because Carolyn Marsh was a woman who, when she said, "I told you not to rush into that marriage," was actually saying something more elaborate and harder to address. And he did not have the architecture for it right now. He sat in the house, his house, the house where the chandelier still scattered light across the mahogany table, and the white peonies in their crystal bowl were still there on the dining room table, slightly past their peak now, the petals beginning to curl at the edges. And he sat with the spices arrived, without preparation, at the experience of being entirely, structurally wrong. He thought about the gallery in London, years ago, the photograph, the way she had talked about it, the specific quality of her attention, which he had mistaken for the attentiveness of someone who needed to be impressed and hadn't understood, was the attentiveness of someone who was used to everything already, and was therefore only interested in things that were genuinely interesting. He thought about the way she had crouched to pick up the broken glass. The absolute dignity of it, the complete absence of humiliation in the movement, as though being asked to perform a humiliating act couldn't actually humiliate her, because humiliation requires a belief that the person delivering it has the power to deliver it, and she had simply never held that belief. He had never known her at all. This was, he sat in the quiet of the house and admitted, the worst of it. Not the job, not the title, not the 6 armored vehicles on the quiet residential street outside. The worst of it was that she had been exactly who she was the entire time, and he had been so busy constructing a version of her that fit his story that he had never once seen the actual person sitting across from him at the dinner table. She had cooked 6 courses. She had ironed the tablecloth twice. She had arranged white peonies in a crystal bowl with the care of someone who understood that beautiful things deserved to be treated as such, and he had called her a servant. He sat in the house until the light changed. In Paris, in the private residential wing of the Valdenmere government's historic townhouse on the Ile Saint-Louis, Elena sat at a writing desk that was old enough to have known other hands entirely, a broad-surfaced piece in dark walnut that had been in the family for 2 centuries, its surface worn smooth in the particular way of wood that has absorbed decades of use and kept all of it. She was looking out the window at the Seine. The river moved with the unhurried certainty it has always moved with, gray and silver and continuous. One of the few things in Paris that does not perform being Parisian. Her father had given her the apartment, not given in the sense of a gift, but given in the sense of returned. This had been her mother's sitting room, and before that, her grandmother's, and the writing desk had been the place where 3 generations of Valdenmere women had composed letters that changed things. She sat at it now, with the weight of that provenance settling around her in the way that a familiar coat settles, noticed only after the absence. There were 12 missed calls on the phone Dominic had the number for. She had looked at the list once, and then set the phone face down on the desk and not looked at it again. There were 17 messages from people in the world she had left at 19, people who had heard through the channels that move information through royal and diplomatic networks faster than any ordinary infrastructure. Old friends, the daughters of allied families, the private secretary of a cousin she had grown up with, all of them saying some version of "I heard," and "We're so glad," and "Please, when you're ready, come and see us." She would answer them eventually. She was not ready yet. She was still in the specific, private interior of a transition, the space between who you have been and who you are returning to being. She was not unhappy. She wanted that to be clear, at least to herself, clear and examined rather than assumed. She had built something in those 7 years, even in the parts of it that had turned out to be wrong. She had learned what she was when she was not being watched. She had learned that she was capable and meticulous, and that she had her father's patience and her mother's eye for quality in people, which she would apply more rigorously going forward. She had learned that love as a concept requires a great deal more specificity than she had given it credit for. That being chosen is not the same as being seen. That a man can choose you for reasons that have nothing to do with you, can choose the idea of you, the version of you that completes his story. And this choosing, despite being real in its way, does not constitute the thing she had left a palace to find. She would try again at some point, not soon, but someday, when the specific weight of this particular lesson had distributed itself properly through her understanding of the world. She would try again, with more precision. With the hard-won knowledge that she did not need to be anonymous to be loved truly, that anonymity had been a test she had imposed on herself, one designed to filter out the wrong reasons, but which had also, she now understood, simply made her harder to see. True love, she thought, looking at the river. True love doesn't need the testing. It sees you and does not require you to prove what you are, because it is not interested in what you are in the sense of category or background or title. It is interested in you specifically, the way you look at a photograph in a gallery, the way you care for things, the way your hands move when you are focused on a task, the way you look at time. She was confident of this in the way she was confident of things she had earned the right to be confident about. She opened the drawer of the writing desk and removed a sheet of paper. Heavy, cream, with the Valdemir crest embossed at the top, the crowned eagle in profile, wings partially extended, the motto beneath it, in the old language of the kingdom, Verum in perpetuum mane, the true endures forever. She picked up a pen. She began to write, not to Dominic, not to anyone at the London house, not to the lawyers who were managing the dissolution of the marriage through channels so efficient and thorough that her involvement would be minimal. She wrote to a friend, a woman she had known at 19, one of the few who had understood that the girl leaving the palace in November with a canvas bag was not abandoning anything but looking for something, who had said at the door quietly, "Come back when you find it." She was writing to say, "I am back. I did not find what I was looking for, but I found something better. I found out who I am when the finding is hard. Come to Paris when you can." She sealed the envelope. She pressed the wax seal with the Valdemir ring, returned to her by her father on the pavement outside the London house, pressed into her palm with the careful solemnity of a man who has been holding it for a decade in the belief that the hand it belonged to would come back. And the seal was warm and then cooled, and she set the letter to one side. Outside the window, the Seine moved on. She leaned back in the chair. She was 30 years old. She was the daughter of a king. She had been, briefly, the wife of a man who did not know her, and she had been, more importantly, herself throughout all of it. Herself in the archive, herself in the kitchen, herself on the pavement watching the armored cars pull away, herself here, at this desk, in this light. True power, she had learned. And this was the lesson she carried out of it, the one that would shape everything that followed. Does not need to shout. It does not need to demand acknowledgement or perform itself for rooms full of people who are watching to see what they should think. It sits in a kitchen for 6 hours, preparing a dinner that no one will properly credit. It picks up broken glass with steady hands. It sends 4 words to a number it has kept for 7 years, and then it waits, because waiting is simply what you do when you know that what is coming is sufficient. Power that knows what it is has no use for spectacle. Spectacle is for people who are not yet sure. She was sure. She had always been sure. She had simply needed for a time to forget it, to set it down and live without it, and discover that it followed her anyway, not as burden, but as quality. The quality of her attention, the quality of her care for things, the quality of the stillness she had held in the dining room while the world rearranged itself around her. She was her mother's daughter and her father's daughter, and the daughter of 6 centuries of a house that had endured precisely because it understood that endurance is not about force, but about rootedness, about knowing what you are when everything external is stripped away. She looked at the sealed letter on the desk. She looked at the river. She looked at the embossed crest on the writing paper. Verum in perpetuum mane. The true endures forever. She smiled at it, quietly, for no one but herself. And now, If you have stayed with this story all the way to this moment, if you were here for the crystal shattering and the cold stillness and the 6 matte black SUVs rolling down a quiet residential street and the look on Dominic Marsh's face when he understood, too late and too completely, what he had dismissed as a servant, then you already know that karma doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a man sitting in a house where the peonies are dying, holding a resignation letter he signed himself, with a voicemail from his mother he cannot bring himself to answer. Sometimes it arrives so quietly and so completely that there is nothing to argue with. What did you think of this story? Did he get exactly what he deserved? Every last piece of it? If you felt something when those doors came open, if you wanted to stand up when she picked up her evening bag and walked out without looking back, then smash that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of power, patience, and the karma that always, always finds its way home.